Hello, Serious Survivor here, and today we're going to talk about what is SHTF. SHTF is an acronym that stands for Shit Hits the Fan, and this is a term that's used with preppers and survivalists and beginning to become popular with the general public that refers to a situation in which normal things are now out of control. This can be due to a destructive event, or it can be due to a collapse of society, either global or nationwide. In this video, we're going to look at different types of SHTF and the different things we could do to prepare. Some of the things that we do to prepare will carry over into every event that we could face, but there are some specialized preps that we should make and specialized skills that we should obtain that will assist us in certain scenarios. Some of these events will require specialized equipment, while some will not. To begin with, we're going to look at some preparations that will carry over into every one of these events. And most of these are our basic preparations that most preppers and survivalists have already obtained and already considered. But I want to put this list up real quick for those who may not have considered some of your basic preps. The first category. This first event is not what I consider a destructive event. The reason I grouped all three of these together is because in the onset of these events, the entire population will still be intact. So that means one of the greatest threats in an SHTF scenario will be there, and that's other people. Of course, not everyone will have ill intentions, but enough will that will make life difficult for a lot of folks out there. An economic collapse can be a desperate and long-lasting situation, as we've seen from our past. It can lead to the other two situations in this category, and that's civil war and martial law. If we look at the current events over the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of civil unrest, and we've heard a lot of talk of martial law. We even see our capital basically fenced in with high perimeter fencing to keep people out. So martial law is not a far-fetched possibility, and these are grouped together because in the initial stages, with an economic collapse, this can very well lead into more civil unrest and ultimately into a civil war. Now, to combat this civil war, the government will most likely issue a form of martial law or a police state type of society. And this will be extremely difficult to continue your everyday way of life. With these types of events, there are a lot of preparations that we can put in place before the event occurs. But one thing to keep in mind is these events may last longer than some of the other ones that we talk about. And what I mean is, an economic collapse will not suddenly collapse and then recover. A civil war will not begin and then suddenly end. Martial law will not start and suddenly stop. These are ongoing events that will probably last years, and that's the difficult part when it comes to preparations, is how do we prepare for years of a lockdown situation, of civil war in the streets, or for economic collapse. And here I'll put together a list of items to help us survive in this type of situation. next category, grid down scenario. This is also a very likely scenario, and it's a dangerous scenario, probably more dangerous than the first category. And the reason for this is when the grid goes down, whether it's due to an EMP, whether it's due to a CME or coronal mass ejection, no matter what the culprit is, if we have a total grid down worldwide or even nationwide, then that loss in power is going to immediately lead into a loss of communications. With social services not being able to communicate, we have no laws or law enforcement officers to enforce our laws at that point. With a grid down situation, we can expect total collapse or total chaos within 72 hours. Even if the governments of the world are trying to work and get the grid back on, if they're trying to maintain law and order, they're not going to be able to do this without communications, and more importantly, without communications to the average citizen. Although the governments of the world may have hardened EMP devices in which they can still communicate with one another and they can still formulate some types of plans, they're not going to be able to communicate this type of information to the average citizen. So we're going to be basically left in the dark without knowing what's going on, how long it will last, and when we could expect any type of help to come. And that's why it's so important to prep for a situation like this. This is an extremely likely situation, and that fact alone should make us think long and hard about this situation and what types of preps that we can make to keep our families and our loved ones safe in a total grid down environment. Number 3, a pandemic, a global pandemic. And when I refer to a global pandemic, I'm not talking about a sickness that makes some people sick. I'm talking about a serious global pandemic that has a high fatality rate. This is a totally different type of scenario than the previous two that we looked at. With a pandemic type of scenario, this is definitely the situation in which you're not going to want to leave your home. You're not going to want to leave the area you're in, because if there is an airborne, say, disease, then we don't know what areas are safe and what areas are not safe. So we have no way of knowing whether an airborne contaminant is in our general vicinity or not, which means that we're going to have to stay localized. We're going to have to stay where we're at. There won't be as much venturing out, at least without specialized equipment. This is the type of event that we plan to bug in for. We've already seen it with 2020, the lockdowns and things such as that. No matter what the views are on that particular situation, let's imagine it much worse. Let's imagine a pandemic that truly does kill basically everyone that catches this disease. Then that becomes a true threat that could eventually wipe out the human race on planet Earth. We have to take this kind of thing seriously, because it's only a matter of time before something like this does come along. And here are some things that we can prepare for and some skills that we can also train at that would help us in this type of event. Number 4, an environmental disaster. And when I say environmental disaster, I'm not necessarily talking about a man-made disaster such as a meltdown from a power plant. I'm not talking about tsunamis or things like that. I'm talking about a major global environmental disaster. And there are two sections of this that come to mind. The first is a supervolcano. In the United States, we have one of the largest supervolcanoes in the world, and that's Yellowstone. And Yellowstone is actually overdue, according to the scientists, for an eruption. It will erupt one day. We don't know when, but one day it certainly will, without a doubt. And this is going to cause a global catastrophe, especially for those in the United States, as the shock waves from this are going to be felt nationwide and most likely throughout the majority of the world. This is going to cause a nuclear winter type of effect. The second type is asteroid impact. Now let's look at the different classifications. A comet is a body of ice, rock, and dust that can be several miles in diameter and orbits the sun. And debris from comets are the main source of what's called meteoroids. A meteoroid is a small, rocky, or metal object, usually between the size of a grain of sand up to a boulder, and it orbits the sun. A meteor. A meteor is a meteoroid that enters the Earth's atmosphere and is burned up or vaporizes. Some people will call these a shooting star. A meteorite is a meteor that hits the Earth before it burns completely up. An asteroid is an object larger than a meteor or meteoroid. It orbits the sun, and it's made up of rock or metal mostly. Historically, objects larger than 10 meters across have been called asteroids. Now, with an asteroid impact, we would have a similar effect to the supervolcano. There would be the initial impact and shock wave that radiated outward for a very large area, depending on the size of the asteroid. Surviving the initial eruption of a supervolcano or the initial impact of an asteroid will basically be the determining factor. At that point, if you are out of range of the initial impacts, the initial firestorms, the initial shock wave, then with the proper preparations and supplies, one can survive for a while. Now, the problem with these types of events is it's going to throw so much dust and debris into the atmosphere, especially with a supervolcano, because as we've seen, when a volcano erupts, it throws millions of tons of dirt and debris into the atmosphere, carried across the globe, basically blanketing the Earth, creating an umbrella effect, not letting sunlight through. We would see that same effect from an asteroid impact. So depending on which scientific experts that you subscribe to, basically, this nuclear winter type of effect would last between 1 to 2 years up to possibly 8 to 10 years. So this can be a lengthy event. Most sides err on the 1 to 2 year range. So this is an event that, if that is true, is definitely survivable if you're not within the initial blast range. Long-term supplies are going to be the key here. Number 5, global nuclear war. Global nuclear war could happen in multiple different ways. Some may equate this back to the EMP, and it's a definite possibility. And nuclear weapons do create an EMP. They do have an electromagnetic pulse that can and will disrupt electronics in the general vicinity. It really depends on the altitude of the nuclear explosion. For it to have a true long-range effect stretching across an entire country or continent, then this is going to have to be detonated high in the atmosphere, and these are designated as HEMPs or HEMPs, or high-altitude electromagnetic pulse. The second type of nuclear explosion that we would see in a nuclear war is what's called an airburst. An airburst takes place in the atmosphere above the ground. Depending on the size of the nuclear weapon will determine the height at which it has to be detonated to prevent the fireball from hitting the ground. If the fireball, the intense heat that's hotter than the surface of the sun, does not touch the surface of the Earth, then it does not vaporize any particles from the Earth, thrusting them into the atmosphere, creating nuclear radioactive fallout. An airburst is designed to counteract that. An airburst is a type of nuclear weapon that is designed to explode high above its target, so that the shock wave, the blast wave, reaches the largest portion of the ground area that it can. At the same time, it is not vaporizing particles on the surface of the Earth and thrusting them into the atmosphere, and that is why an airburst will not create much radioactive fallout. A surface burst, on the other hand, will create a lot of radioactive fallout, and this depends on the size of the burst. A surface burst takes place either on the surface or at a height above the surface when the fireball from the initial explosion hits the ground. When the fireball hits the ground, it vaporizes everything that it touches. Those particles are then pushed up into the atmosphere and distributed across the globe. So one may ask, which type could we expect? And that really depends on the attacking country's position towards the country they're attacking. And what I mean is, if the attacking country plans to invade the nation, they're most likely going to use an EMP or airburst. And the reason is the EMP will wipe out all communications and all electronics for the most part. Not all, but for the most part. It'll knock out the infrastructure, which prevents a lot of the smaller devices from working, even if they did survive. And that would leave it ripe for an invasion. If the attacking country's goal is to basically decimate or destroy a nation, then you can expect these to be surface bursts. Because by being a surface burst, not only does it do the damage from the explosion, but it irradiates that area, it contaminates that area, so that people cannot enter that area for an extended period of time. Specialized equipment will be required to survive this type of event, and here's a list of some of that. These are some events that are very possible. Very possible. According to the news, we're in a pandemic now. There are threats of EMPs all the time. We see an economic collapse on the horizon, which could possibly lead to civil war, which would in turn lead to martial law. Environmental impacts, we know that Yellowstone's overdue. An asteroid impact, it's just a matter of time. Maybe not in our lifetime, but it's going to happen again. And then a global nuclear war. Well, that's it for now. Thanks a lot for listening. God bless. And for now, Serious Survivor, out.